The history of Canada's Wonderland. The 80s. September 15th, 1857 in Cincinnati, Ohio, saw the birth of the 27th President of the United States, William Howard Taft. A single-term president with his leadership generally recognized in name only, Taft passed his later years as a figurehead of the League to Enforce Peace organization, which set the framework for the United Nations. The embrace of international peace would be a legacy of concern that would permeate throughout the Taft family, and many years later, one of its members would look to their nation neighbor to the north to propose a different operation focused on a celebration of the world's culturally diverse nations. It was to be a park near Toronto that was to be unlike anything ever attempted in Canada and the largest ever venture for its owner. A place where families and friends could gather to celebrate the sights, sounds, foods, and thrills of various communities from around the world. That place was to be called Canada's Wonderland. Fire. Its unprincipled destruction was a familiar danger in Toronto in its early years. From the loss of the city's original Parliament building, the razing and burning of Fort York by American troops in the War of 1812, or the Great Fire of 1904, Toronto and fire had not a pleasant history. Smaller fires in 1955 devastated Sunnyside Pavilion, the city's lone surviving amusement park at the time. Toronto had not an altogether successful experience with amusement parks up to that point. 3 of the city's operations had not survived the Depression. Hanlon's Point Amusement Park on Toronto Island would close in the early 1930s, although the family amusement park Centerville now runs close to that park's original location. Scarborough Beach Amusement Park, located to the east of the city, had the largest thrill component with its shoot-the-chutes and 707-foot roller coaster. This park would sadly only last 18 years before making way for residential housing. The most celebrated among the golden era of amusement parks in the city was Sunnyside Park and Pavilion, the entrance to which can still be seen by travelers entering the city from the Gardiner Expressway that now covers the original location. For the decades that followed, the city had no proper amusement park to call its own. It wasn't until the early 1970s and a boom in the industry that brought interest from developers to the Toronto region. By that time, a rapidly expanding population, economy, and only the brief 3-week Canadian National Exhibition down the newly built Gardiner served as any competition in the market. A few attractions from Sunnyside Park ended up at the CNE, while Sunnyside Park's original carousel traveled south to a new park in California set up by an ambitious gray-suited man. With Expo 67 opening in Montreal and its resultant Laurent Amusement Park, Toronto was underserved in the amusement park market. The area had previously seen interest from the Disney park chain. However, their model of year-round operations and the harsh winter climates did not encourage them to proceed. Around the same time in the late 1960s, while Laurent in Montreal was settling into its amusement and midway-focused future, the Taft Broadcasting Corporation, south of the border in Cincinnati, had been approached by Coney Island, the city's long-running amusement park, with interests of a new vision for their park that was under frequent threat of flooding and needed to move. The result was Kings Island, opened in May of 1972 in Mason, Ohio, a world-class theme park at the time and still today. Taft was emerging as a major player in the media industry with 6 television stations, 6 radio stations, 5 amusement parks, and the Hanna-Barbera Cartoon Network among its properties, which was prime for theming throughout Kings Island. After that park's successful first season, the newly merged Kings Entertainment looked to widen their expanding collection of theme parks. The company's young president, Dudley Taft, great-grandson of William H., looked at the Greater Toronto Area as one of the prime options for a new park. Taft saw a market bereft of a dignified option for thrill-seeking fans, with 4 million plus in the region, not within the reach of a major theme park. Initially, several possible locations for the project were considered, including Niagara Falls, Cambridge, Milton. They eventually settled on Maple as the winning region, as it was immediately near the newly built Highway 400 and about 40-minute drive north of the city. Vaughan was established in 1792 originally as a settlement for German and Dutch tradesmen that grew around a rural focus with the rich soil offered in the area. One of Maple's longtime residents was Elmer McKinnon. He was born in July of 1912 in a farmhouse on the 200-acre rural dairy farm his family had owned and run since 1842. The land was purchased then for $2,000, and McKinnon worked the operation till 1962, when he sold the farm to Finley Dairies and retired to nearby Richmond Hill. 1973. Another resident of Vaughan was Jim Cameron, a geology professor at U of T and a member of City Council from the mid-1970s. He became a prominent figure locally regarding environmental and development issues, where the area of Maple, then a small town of only 2,000 people, enjoyed a sleepy farm-focused existence compared to the rapidly growing city to the south. The town had only recently been selected as a site for a massive landfill for that city's waste, and with a difficult fight against a public interest, locals moved their not-so-warm attention to the proposal of an American amusement park opening on their turf. Fearing an old-style carnival that would be an eyesore, as well as the project's owners being a thinly veiled conduit for Americanized influence, SAVE emerged, sensible approach to Vaughan's environment, which was led by Ted Pickles, a local teacher. It opposed Wonderland and enlisted Cameron and over 800 others within its support base. Problematic to SAVE's concerns was the provincial government's Toronto-centered region plan that featured Vaughan as preferred for metro development. Despite the protests of Cameron and SAVE, Taft purchased a 370-acre site, including the original McKinnon Farm, between Major Mackenzie Drive and Rutherford Road, just east of the newly built 400 highway. Total price, $2.5 million. Efforts to recognize the rural history of the area were dwarfed by the projected yearly tax revenues from the project of $3.9 million. A resultant recommendation by the Ontario Provincial Board study suggested that the Ministry of Culture and Recreation should oversee the park's efforts to include Canadian content in their exhibits. 1975. Now, with word of Taft's plans reaching other local amusement establishments such as Ontario Place, the Canadian National Exhibition, and the Royal Ontario Museum, they objected to the park's construction, mostly on grounds that the Toronto market would not be able to sustain a theme park successfully. Much of the public agreed, and the ecology of the area was also an area of concern among wider spread locals. Toronto, early in its development towards the global city it is today, originally planned for residential growth east of the city, opposite to the northwestern location of Wonderland today. Due to the proximity of Highway 400, Taft was able to convince the city of the viability of its chosen location in Maple, and in the process, the city was able to secure a highway overpass and infrastructure necessary for its construction. $4.5 million in roadworks were part of their bill, including reconstruction of the fronting of Jane Street, a new highway off-ramp, and access road, along with a $1 million 2-mile sewer that, in a gesture of goodwill by Taft, was built larger than necessary to allow for local residents, some that were originally opposed to the park, utilized for their homes. Over the next period, Taft was required to receive approval from various boards and levels of government, including the Ontario Municipal Board, the Town of Vaughan, the Region of York, the Provincial Cabinet, and the Federal Foreign Investment Review Agency. In all, taking them through 5 years and an additional $12 million in costs through inflation for the park. Taft had said afterwards, "If we had to do it again, I'm not so sure we'd go ahead." 1976. By early July, Taft had received approval to build the park, which at the time was proposed to cost $50 million. While Cameron, SAVE, and the few outspoken deterrents did their best to prevent the operation, Taft continued research and development of the ambitious project. Among their findings were that one of their chief brand characters, Yogi Bear, received greater reception in Canada than in America, an observance that would lead to the character figuring prominently in the park early on. Taft had secured Winnipeg-based Great Western Life to finance a large portion of the construction cost in exchange for a 25% stake in the operation. Taft then had only to raise $22 million in capital through the U.S. debt market to see the operation move ahead. While many at the time complained about American investment, the final figures showed that the majority of the investment came from Canadian dollars. Taft expected the park to earn $46 million in its first year and to earn back their investment within 6 to 8 years. Other finalized investors included Sun Life Assurance Corporation of Canada, Prudential Insurance Corporation of America, Standard Life Assurance Corporation, Toronto Dominion Bank, and Lumbermen's Mutual Casualty Corporation. The park's first general operations manager, Dee Narup, was one of a handful of Taft-experienced Ohio-based and related managers that were positioned to lead Wonderland into existence. 1978, design work commenced in Cincinnati, where at one time up to 300 illustrators, architects, engineers, and site planners were working on the project. Site planner Bruce Robinson was born in Toronto and moved with his family to Ohio when he was 5. He had not so fond memories of visiting the only amusement offering in the region at the time, the CNE, finding it not appropriate for families and a little rough, much like its only permanent coaster, the Flyer. Little could he have known that decades later he would be charged with the overall design of Canada's only theme park. In early June 1978, Premier Bill Davis's provincial government passed his approval for the Taft proposal, to the outrage of some locals. Despite the protests, a silent majority welcomed the venture and the business and tourism it would draw to the area. Its farming past quickly wasting away under modern pressure. A new horizon was in the future for once sleepy Maple. 1979. With funding officially secured on April 2nd, construction of Canada's Wonderland officially began. On June 13th, Bill Davis pressed a plunger, detonating a ceremonial groundbreaking explosion on the construction site from the St. Lawrence Centre in Toronto. Attendees were treated to a performance by Canadian artist Paul Soles, best known as the original voice of Spider-Man, along with an exclusive appearance of Yogi Bear. Construction of the project was spearheaded by Robert Smith of Burlington, Ontario, who over a decade earlier was charged with the construction of Expo 67 in Montreal. 1980. Different to other parks in the King's Entertainment chain, Wonderland would incorporate a large artificial mountain as its centerpiece, which would prove an inspired move. Not only would it allow for traffic passing by on Highway 400 to witness its construction and naturally advertise the park's opening, but it would go on doing so for years afterwards, until eventually being dwarfed over time by larger attractions. 1,100 tons of structural steel were required to construct the $5 million mountain. Its waterfall, at 60 feet high and 100 feet wide, with 3,500 gallons of water a minute falling over its front-facing falls and other small areas of falls, the structure also acts as a cooling system for section of the park's air conditioning. Steel workers that built the CN Tower several years earlier built a rectilinear steel framework found in many office buildings. The basic structure follows the framework of a parking garage with several box sections on top. Swimming pool builders were hired to construct the metal wiring of the peaks around these, and 2 inches of concrete were then sprayed over this, then covered with a finishing layer of latex to create the final product. Without a definite plan, sections were built and reconstructed as needed, likely leading to structural problems later on. 100 carpenters were hired from the region, along with 200 independent contractors to handle the various building requirements. Landscaping was done by Moorhead, Fleming, and Corbin Inc., just one of dozens of independent contractors hired for the park who were given a total budget of $12 million. aiming to preserve the natural terrain of the area, along with the small creek which provided drainage for farms located to the north. Large earthworks in the form of mounds known as berms provided sound insulation from the highway, and for guests in the parking lot, providing anticipation before entering the grounds. 85 acres of grass were required to finish the landscape, $3 million of flowers were installed, and 75,000 trees were purchased and planted from Pickering and other surrounding areas. 2.9 million interlocking stones were used to construct the park's 15 acres of pathways, some of which were reused from the recently closed Danforth streetcar line in Toronto. Led by Ernst Zimmerman, the park, in what was evidence of the care and attention to details the constructors held, had no asphalt pathways, which sadly only is retained in Planet Snoopy today. Existent wooded areas were intentionally incorporated into the plan's layout to preserve them, leaving a large forest for the originally planned Frontier Canada themed area. 8 public washrooms were built. 450 speakers run by a computerized system were placed throughout to pump carefully selected theme music chosen from a dedicated staff, only to be bemoaned by some future guests as too loud. 2,634 seats in total were installed, with some 600 in the main International Street Central area.
It's morning in Happy Land.
The main headline grabber were the 5 roller coasters that were to debut with the park. For families was Scooby's Gasping Ghoster Coaster, designed by Curtis D. Sumners, who was also chief engineer and would go on to design all the wood coaster models in the park. Now known as Ghoster Coaster, it is a miniature-sized wooden coaster similar to the earlier model found at Kings Island. Flowerenzian, an international festival, was a Mack version 2 standard powertrain. Originally located next to the mountain, this double helix figure 8 model would soon find itself used in a more iconic fashion by the park.
The Cyclops. The Minotaur. The Gorgon. Come, ride the dragon fire. Ride the dragon fire. Canada's Wonderland.
The Aerodynamics of California provided the country's thrill seekers with their first 4 inverting monster of their own, Dragonfire, costing $2.5 million. Proudly located along the front parking lot for guests to look at in awe or terror before entering. The park also distinguished itself with 2 major wood coasters. The Mighty Canadian Mindbuster, a giant out-and-back model based on the Shooting Star, a ride once located at the original Coney Island Park in Cincinnati. And Wild Beast, a figure 8 out-and-back also based on the Wildcat design, also found at Coney Island. The Philadelphia Toboggan Company had originally been hired to build and design the wood coasters on the Wonderland site. However, it went bankrupt in 1979. While not officially recorded, it is thought that the rides were completed by King's Entertainment's own in-house carpentry team, as they had just come off the recent experience of constructing the gargantuan The Beast again at Kings Island. 900,000 board feet of U.S. imported chemically impregnated yellow pine to prevent rot was used to build the coasters. The park was also to feature 5 themed areas. Much controversy was raised over the failure to include a 6th. Mike Filey, among the park's operation team, claimed at the time that Frontier Canada was not finished due to inflated cost. $30 million for this section was needed to be completed. Originally to feature was an area on the Yukon Gold Rush, a logging show, and another themed area based on the Robert Service poem, The Cremation of Sam McGee, a lighthearted tale about a prospector frozen to death, told by the man cremating him. It is safe to say now that despite the recent effort to complete the area, its true vision will never be realized. All the Taft IP-related attractions were initially built at the time with bespoke fixtures that clearly consumed a considerable portion of the budget at consequence for the Canadian-focused attractions. No Universal hot dog or hamburger stands were to be found in the park, although Barney's Burgers was formed and is sorely missed today. 190 full-time and 2,000 seasonal employees were eventually hired to run the first season. Originally, uniforms for all staff were provided, along with a park cleaning service, 3 for each employees, 1 for the day's use, 1 for cleaning, and 1 for their locker. Management planned to limit daily attendance to 40,000 visitors in the first year, despite a 50,000 30,000 capacity. The parking lot, taking up near 80 acres alone, holds 12,000 parking spaces. On schedule, but now at nearly 2.5 times its original budget at $123 million, Canada's Wonderland prepared to welcome a curious and somewhat suspicious public to the marvel that had arisen from its nondescript fields over the course of only 25 months. 1981.
Henry V. Richard the Lion-Hearted. King Arthur and the Round Table. Canada's Wonderland.
A $2 million advertising campaign led the announcement that Wonderland was to open to the general public that spring of 1981. A preview event was then held over the weekend of May 16th and 17th at half the park's capacity of 20,000 people. It was not without the usual rookie problems, characterized by lineups of over 2 hours for hamburgers according to some accounts. In response, the park immediately increased the food and beverage staff from 600 to 800. On May 23rd, 1981, Dudley Taft and Bill Davis opened the park in front of a crowd of 12,000 invited guests. Featuring 13 skydivers, the release of 10,000 balloons and 350 doves, a pipe band, and Wayne Gretzky raising the Canadian flag among the ceremonies. 4 children representing the Pacific, Arctic, Great Lakes, and Atlantic regions of Canada each poured a vial of their area's water into the park's fountain. Taft had created a global showcase to rival the best on offer in the world at Canada's Wonderland. On entering the park, guests entered International Street, where various shops greet them, selling unique and imported items. One doll shop offered items ranging in price from $325 to $350. Each building was named after their themes: Latin, Scandinavian, Mediterranean, and Alpine. The 600 seats were spread amongst various dining establishments, offering high-quality traditional food items such as open-faced sandwiches, baked goods, traditional pizzas, paella, and others. Patios were originally located on upper floors overlooking the waterfall, central fountains, also found at sister parks Kings Island and Kings Dominion, and the street, at the end of which was the park's centerpiece mountain. To the right was Medieval Fair. After the grand entry, guests encounter Canterbury Theatre, a fully equipped, enclosed proscenium theatre stage, the flagship eatery All's Wells Inn, serving meat pies, sausage platters, and beer, had indoor and outdoor seating looking over the central Arthur's Bay. Dragonfire, with a metal sculpture created by local sculptor Bill Lishman greeting victims at its entrance, stands nearby. Further on, Coyote's Kettles, a Mac Calypso tilted teacups ride, greets guests. Viking's Rage, a Huss swinging pirate ship, joins Sea Scepter, a pirate boat on Arthur's Bay built on the skeletal remains of an old Baltic Sea, where an acrobatic show occurs over the bay. Beyond this is Wild Nightmares, a Huss UFO spinning thrill ride. The area ends with a plaza where another Lishman sculpture of a boar fronts Wild Beast. Arthur's Bay Mill and Bakery completes this heavily themed area, where it's still serving funnel cakes as it did on opening, albeit not under the same name or for the 90-cent price. Next to Wonder Mountain is International Festival, featuring an assortment of flat rides and a Bavarian harvest theme. Originally, a market was planned for inside the mountain, but this was later shelved for unknown reasons. It was also from this area that guests could travel behind the waterfall of Wonder Mountain, whereas various times a day still, divers plunged from atop the summit. Further along, guests could find entry to a path that led to the top of Wonder Mountain. There, one could capture the best views of the surrounding park and observe other water features at a closer proximity. In the Grand World Exposition of 1890 section of the park, a large assortment of flat rides were located around the centerpiece Crystal Palace Arcade building. Many of these rides no longer exist in the park today, but were popular at the time, including Sol Loco, a Huss giant enterprise, Shiva's Fury, Great Wheel of China, Pharaoh's Eye, and the aerodynamics log flume, Zumba flume, all opened in this section of the park along with an antique carousel dating from 1928. This was originally built by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company. It was rescued from Vancouver and refurbished to its current well-preserved condition. An 8-piece jazz band also played from the area's Victorian grandstand, the whole section faithfully rendered to that period. Finally, Happyland was the children's area of the park, split into a central Scoobyville with 2 satellite sections, the short-lived Yogi's Woods and the Flintstones-themed Bedrock section. Rides in this section were among the best themed, and some still run today. A marine life theater known as Bedrock Aquarium originally opened where the Saltwater Circus Show presented sea lions and dolphin routines for packed audiences. Following the first soft weekend of operation, the park was open to the public daily the following weekend till September 7th. A provision of the original town approvals included a ban on secondary industries near the park like gas stations, fast food outlets, and pool parlors. None would be granted permission by the local council to open nearby in an effort to prevent a recurrence of the cluster of businesses found around Disneyland. Another proposal was from the park to later open a 20,000-seat amphitheater on land owned north of Major Mackenzie Drive. Talks were staged with the Nederlander Corporation about a partnership to bring their stage shows to the venue. In a final victory of the SAVE group, this plan was never realized, and instead a slightly smaller venue would open shortly later. Entrance to the park would put one back $9.95 and $9.25 for children and seniors at the time. Attraction tickets were offered in books of 12 for $11.95 to $10.95 for children and seniors, and 16 at $13.95 to $12.95 respectively. The all-inclusive Ride All Day Passport was $23.50 regardless of age. The coupons could be used for rides and shows, were undated, and could be used at any time. Outside food was not allowed, but the park built a dedicated area just outside the main gate for families to dine with their own options. On Saturday nights, the park would stay open till midnight, mainly in an effort to spread out traffic leaving the park later in the evening. At the end of its first year, the park had grossed more than $45 million and welcomed 2.2 million visitors. It was one of only 4 seasonal parks to attract more than 2 million visitors in its opening year. An average visitor that year spent $20.28 per visit. Officials from Taft met the park's operations team late in October to discuss the results and future, and were reported to be gratified by the public's warm acceptance of the park overall. 1982. The park continued on the success of the previous year, long lifting their 40,000 attendance restriction, and also opened the King's Courtyard event dining areas underneath Dragonfire. Late to the party, then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and future PM and son Justin, along with the rest of the family, visited the park. Despite success, there were no discussions between the PM and the park regarding their Frontier Canada section at the time, and it continued to be delayed. 1983. The park is forced to close its gates on June 5th due to overcrowding, possibly due to the first hot day of the summer. That season also sees the opening of the new 15,000-seat Kingswood Music Theatre, welcoming Canadian country and folk music icon Anne Murray as its first headline performer. Kingswood featured entrances both inside and outside of the park and was the realization of the owner's original plans of a larger venue north of their property. 1984. Whitewater Canyon opens with the park on opening day, a $5 million Intamin rafting ride requiring 42,000 tons of limestone from an Orillia, Ontario quarry to create the 2-meter deep canyons on its 427-meter course. Rafts travel at 24 kilometers an hour down an overall elevation of 10 feet through a previously undeveloped wooded area of the park. Carp of up to 2 feet live and travel through the canyon waters, which were not placed there, but somehow appeared to the confusion of the construction crew. By then, the park had 60 permanent employees, 3,500 summer workers, and among them 200 dancers and live performers. The loss prevention department comprised 100 security, fire services, and first aid employees, headquartered at the park's dedicated 14-bed first aid facility. At the end of the operational season on October 20th, the park announced their next major attraction with the presentation of a model of an unnamed stand-up looping coaster already opened the previous year at the chain's other park, King Cobra. 1985.
Step in,
But don't sit down, 'cause there ain't no seats. There ain't no seats. Can you stand it? You can't sit down. Where's the seats? There ain't no seats.
Ride the new Skyrider, Canada's first stand-up coaster at Canada's Wonderland.
We get it! There's always something new at Canada's Wonderland.
1986. King's Entertainment takes full control of the park from Taft Broadcasting Corp. in June in a deal worth $90 million. On May 3rd, 1986, Thunder Run opened to the public to reveal once and for all the secrets of Wonder Mountain's depths. 1987. The park's spotty early history with unruly crowds during the Victoria holiday weekend were compounded on May 18, 1987, when patrons complained after the closing fireworks display of waits up to 5 hours to board the few available buses to surrounding regions. A near riot breaks out with a crowd of 3,000 people crushing one another in a scramble. Public phones were ripped from their fittings during the melee. 3 ambulances were called, while 1 woman was treated for hyperventilation. 1988. The opening of the 1988 season and the troublesome May holiday weekend would lead to tragedy when Rodney Joyce, an 18-year-old guest from North York, drowned while being rescued from the dive pool of Wonder Mountain. Joyce had jumped into the pool to retrieve 2 frisbees when he apparently got caught in a current. He was drawn to the center and exhausted by the pond's circular current in an area 6 feet deep. Eyewitness accounts report more than 100 people around the area when Joyce jumped in. Park diver Mike Seward's furthered controversy, claiming that up to 30 to 40 people could be seen diving into the pool during the unusually hot spring day. That same day, more than 60,000 patrons were in the park, with another 50,000 outside to watch the evening's fireworks. There was also a major fight inside the front entrance, where 4 charges were laid by police, who were forced to call in reinforcements to manage the crowd. The problems initially rose when the park reached capacity and closed its gates at approximately 7 p.m. This also caused a bottleneck of traffic on all highway directions leading towards the park. Disappointed latecomers were forced to pull over to the sides of roadways in hopes of catching the fireworks display, but were instructed to move on by police. By 10:30 p.m. and the end of the fireworks, major queues formed to exit the area in the parking lot and highways. Fed up with the long wait, the crowd began to become unruly, especially in busing areas underserved due to the traffic. Various fights ensued, and security called in the assistance of 45 local police officers. Among these, 1 was bitten by a woman who was charged during the fracas. Overall, the park was bottlenecked with 100,000 people trying to leave the area all at once. Meanwhile,
You at Canada's Wonderland. It's wet and wild racing rivers. The water slides you ride with your clothes on. Take the plunge on Pharaoh's Falls as you plummet 3 stories on a speeding water sled, or twist and turn through the awesome tunnels of Water Snake. Hurry to participating McDonald's restaurants now for your coupon to save $4 each off the regular passport. New racing rivers. Bet you can't stay dry. Only at Canada's Wonderland, because Wonderland's the one.
Racing Rivers opened as the modest new attraction. Barry Jones, the park's new general manager, stated it was chosen for its focus on family thrills and cost the park $2 million. It comprised of Pharaoh's Falls, 2 9-meter slides that drop at an angle of 40 degrees, and Water Snake, where from a height of 12 meters, riders slide through one of 2 zigzagging enclosed blue slides, 110 meters long. Sadly, water collected in the bottom of these rafts will provide an unintended wet sensation immediately on sitting inside, and Pharaoh's was often more thrilling when one of its riders lost the raft in the 80-foot-long skid pad. Water rides in Wonderland's first decade had been a major investment, second only to roller coasters throughout. In the fall of that year, an inquest jury concluded that a set of standardized safety measures should be put in place for all public parks with dangerous water areas. The jury concluded that Rodney Joyce had drowned from a combination of fatigue and was unable to swim from the current of the falls pushing him towards the center of the pond. The end of the year also saw new Canadian ownership of the park, as Toronto developer J.D. JDS Investments, along with developer Bramley Limited, announced in October that they would be purchasing an 80% control of the park for $72 million in cash and the assumption of $68 million of the park's liabilities. King's Entertainment would return a 20% ownership, along with a deal to continue managing the operations of the park for the next 10 years. 1989. Timberwolf Falls, a shoot-the-chutes giant wave water ride, takes the 50-foot plunge into the park's lineup. As the season began, the Victoria Day weekend fireworks approached for the final time in the 80s, and Wonderland had hoped that the traditionally volatile period would pass without incident. Instead, a group of youths, described in accounts by police regretfully as non-whites, threw bricks and bottles when confronted by forces around midnight at the park's gates. The officers, amounting 60 in total, arrested 13 people before and during the clash for weapons and assault offenses. 5 others were taken into custody and later released. Some of the arrests were due to people climbing the park fences after closing. Given the number of arrests, and despite park accounts of a more orderly situation than in previous years, it was among the ugliest of nights in the park's history. The merger of Bramley and JDS came with their disclosure of the intent of opening a new major retail mall in the area, along with hotels and other investments, which would be enough to spin the heads of former SAVE members. But the future of the area, regardless of their wishes, would head in that direction anyway, and before long the farmers' fields that once surrounded Wonderland would soon be filled with developments of various kinds. Also looked at by JDS was an astronomical proposal to build a dome over the park, potentially a dream folly triggered by the newly built Sky Dome in downtown Toronto. On September 17th, Susan Adams, 27, of the city of York, collapsed after a ride on the mighty Canadian Mindbuster. She was transferred to a nearby hospital where she died a short time later. The initial cause of death was not discovered until a preceding heart condition, myocarditis, was deemed to have contributed to her death due to a sudden surge of adrenaline that caused her heart to stop. She is the first ride-related fatality in the park's history. While the decade had ended with the park's darkest period, overall, Canada's Wonderland had been a major success. The community of Maple, which once sought its prevention, flourished around it, and from the millions that visited each year. The big gamble that Dudley Taft had fought so long and earnestly for had paid off, even if by then his dream project was no longer in his hands. What he and the thousands that have over the years built was and still is one of the most successful theme parks in the world. A gamble that has been the wonder of other theme parks the world over. Elmer McKinnon, meanwhile, the farmer whose family once owned the property, was granted a lifetime season's pass. We hope you enjoyed this special presentation of Canada's Wonderland's early years. The story will soon continue.